Good evening and welcome back to 31 Horror Nights. It's October 18th and tonight's classic is Pan's Labyrinth. This is the most recent film of all the 31 that I'm watching from 2006, and if you think that that's not far back enough for something to achieve classic status, just keep in mind, we are just as close to 2030 as we are to 2006 at this point. Pan's Labyrinth is a dark fantasy movie directed by Guillermo del Toro, who's gotten a lot of notoriety recently when he won Best Picture and Best Director for his movie The Shape of Water. Last year I watched two of his movies for 31 Horror Nights, The Devil's Backbone and Crimson Peak, and I thought that both of them were good, especially Crimson Peak, which was a beautiful movie. I mentioned Pan's Labyrinth a couple times while I was talking about those movies. I had seen Pan's Labyrinth even before last year's 31 Horror Nights. This year I decided to rewatch it to see if it was as good as I remember it being. I'd say it's not as good, maybe a little bit downward, but it's still a pretty good movie. My grade for Pan's Labyrinth is 8 out of 10. While not as good looking as Crimson Peak, this movie has a really good story and a lot of creative ideas in it. There are essentially two stories happening at once in Pan's Labyrinth. The first one is more of a historical story about something happening in Spain a little bit after the Spanish Civil War. A captain of the Nationalists and his group are trying to take down some of the remains of the communist side. And the leader of that nationalist group, the captain, is the main character, Ophelia's stepfather. The other plot going on is the fantasy one. It's about Ophelia doing things and going on quests to prove herself as the reincarnation of a princess from an underground world who came up years ago and disappeared. She meets a faun and she goes on a bunch of magical adventures, or is it an adventure if you don't technically leave your house? I'm not sure about that. But anyway, yeah, those two stories are going on at the same time and they bleed into each other in a lot of places. And I have to say, the girl that they got to play Ophelia, her name is Ivano Baquero, she was really, really good. She turned in a good performance, not just as a child actor, but just as an actor in general. I really do like a lot of the fantasy ideas in Pan's Labyrinth. Probably the most famous scene in the entire movie is going down into a room where the Pale Man lives. I don't think they actually say that name in the movie, but that's the name that this monster has come to be known as. A really, really good design. It's emaciated, but also flabby at the same time. It doesn't have any eyes, but it has spaces on its hands where it shoves eyeballs in and then it holds its hands in front of his face to look around. It's a very, very cool design for a monster. The design for the faun is also very interesting and unique to this movie too. It's honestly kind of creepy looking. It's definitely not cute or whimsical looking. It looks almost kind of beastly. And I will say, the effects that they used to create the faun and the Pale Man both hold up very, very well. I'm pretty sure that these are a mix of CGI and practical effects, and it looks like it's really there, and it looks good. On the other hand, a lot of the other creatures, I'm pretty sure that this was the case with the giant frog that was landing under a tree that you meet at one point, and the fairies that were sort of the tiny little sidekicks of Ophelia. Those are entirely CGI, and those effects don't really hold up so well. But overall, I really did like all the fantasy stuff that they put in Pan's Labyrinth. I like the settings, I like the designs, I like just the ideas that were presented. But throughout this movie, that's really only half of the runtime. Probably actually less than half the runtime. A lot more of the runtime is taken up by the war subplot. That part of the movie is well done in its own way, but it's so eclipsed by how clever and well done the fantasy elements are that I just kind of want to keep getting back to the fantasy part of the movie. I think part of the reason why Pan's Labyrinth is so beloved by so many people is that it's sort of like a fairy tale made for adults. There's a lot of things in it that are very Alice in Wonderland or Grimm's fairy tales or stuff like that, but it's made grittier and darker, and there's more of an element of danger. And not to mention, it's also attached to basically this war movie. A big theme of the film is the differences in the way that children see the world and the way that adults see the world, and that's shown very well and represented by the fact that it almost feels like there are two plots in this movie. There are a lot of things to like in Pan's Labyrinth, and I would recommend it if you want to see it. I don't know if it's quite as good as I've been told that it is. This has been called one of the best movies of this entire millennium. I don't really think that, but I would call it Guillermo del Toro's best movie, at least out of the ones that I've seen. I haven't seen Shape of Water. This is a very unique movie and a very good example of a dark fantasy done well. Okay, time for some spoilers. Things sort of come to a head at the very end of the movie when the faun tells Ophelia that her final test to prove that she's the princess and can go live forever in the wonderful underworld, whatever thing, is that she needs to take her recently born little brother. The mother died during childbirth, and her stepfather, the captain guy, always wants to keep the son in his sight. The captain is very adamant about having a son that would sort of follow in his footsteps. I think that's because his dad died pretty early on and he didn't really know him. But anyway, Ophelia manages to take the baby and goes to the entrance of the labyrinth, and the faun tells her that the only way to open it is to spill the blood of an innocent, and he says it's just going to be a little pinprick, but she says absolutely not, and he says, are you willing to give up being a princess and living happily for all of eternity just for this child that you barely know? And she says yes. And that's the point where the captain, the stepfather, comes in, and I always just sort of thought that the faun was hiding from the other people, but apparently, he can't see the faun. So he goes up to her, takes the baby, and shoots her. And when he leaves the labyrinth, there was a whole other subplot, the revolutionaries sort of took the camp that all the soldiers were staying at, and they take the baby from him and shoot him, but they go back to the entrance to the labyrinth and they see Ophelia bleeding out and dying, and part of her blood falls into the hole that's the entrance to the labyrinth, and that was the test, that she was more willing to spill her own blood than that of an innocent. So while she did die, it is more of a happy ending because she goes back to the underground kingdom and she meets her real father and mother, or at least real as in her soul's real father and mother, and she lives a happy life. And I'm pretty sure that the brother ends up with Mercedes, who was one of the maids. She was also part of the resistance, and she would have been a much better person to take care of this child than the father at the very least. So all things considered, it was a sort of happy ending, although it was kind of a lot of dark things in order to get there. Pan's Labyrinth is a pretty good movie. There's a lot of really good ideas in it. There's a lot of great visuals in this movie. I enjoy just sort of the world that's created in this labyrinth, though I do wish that it was utilized better. Pretty good, though not as good as I feel like it could have been. Alright, I'll see you tomorrow.